Have you ever looked at the world and wondered why some people accumulate incredible wealth while others struggle? Or maybe how economic ideas, ideas from centuries ago, still echo in our financial systems today? These are the big questions, right? About who has what and why. Well, today we're taking a deep dive into exactly that, the historical dynamics of wealth and income. It's a topic that, honestly, touches every single one of us, shaping our opportunities, our societies, and even our futures. Our mission today is to unpack a truly groundbreaking 15-year research project. This was conducted between 1998 and 2013, and it meticulously delved into the historical evolution of wealth and income. We'll explore how brilliant minds over the centuries grappled with these forces, examine what the actual data reveals across different countries and time periods, and really confront the big questions about inequality, capital, and the role of government. We're going to try and make some truly complex economic and philosophical ideas super accessible. We'll break them down step by step using real-world analogies and clear definitions. Think of it as your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about the biggest economic questions of our time without feeling overwhelmed.
And it really is unprecedented research. What's truly unique here, I think, is that this work isn't just theoretical. It draws on an absolutely massive database covering 20 countries. It's easily the most comprehensive historical look at income and wealth inequality we have available. It builds on some really foundational work, like studies on high-income earners in France and crucial collaborations on the U.S. case. That earlier research, you might remember, famously revealed the vertiginous growth of income of the top 1% since the 1970s and 1980s. So with the support of scholars like Anthony Atkinson and Emmanuel Saez, this deep dive gives us an unparalleled lens through which to view centuries of economic change. We're going to tackle some fundamental concepts, ones often debated, but frankly rarely with such detailed historical depth. It's a journey into the economic past that really illuminates our present.
Okay, let's set the stage then. Imagine living at the end of the 18th century. The world was being utterly transformed by the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Cities were exploding, factories were springing up everywhere, and old ways of life were rapidly crumbling. It was a time of immense social and economic upheaval, often chaotic and deeply uncertain. Two prominent figures of that era, Reverend Malthus and Arthur Young, looked at this unfolding drama and drew some, profoundly unsettling conclusions about where society was headed.
They absolutely did. Reverend Malthus, when he published his famous essay on the principle of population back in 1798, came to conclusions that were, frankly, radical even for his time. Like Young, he was profoundly worried by the new political ideas sweeping in from France, particularly the French Revolution's emphasis on equality and popular sovereignty. Malthus was terrified, really, that similar upheaval could engulf Great Britain. To avert this, he proposed some extremely severe measures. He argued that all welfare assistance to the poor should be halted immediately, and even suggested that reproduction by the poor should be severely scrutinized. His grim prophecy, the one he's most famous for, was that human population would inevitably grow faster than the food supply. This would lead, he thought, to widespread famine, chaos, and misery for everyone. Young, though the sources don't detail his specific observations as much, broadly shared Malthus's dark or even apocalyptic views of the long-run evolution of the distribution of wealth and class structure of society.
And when we hear those prophecies of doom today, it's easy to dismiss them, isn't it? With the benefit of hindsight, we know that widespread collapse didn't quite happen in the way they predicted. But what were they actually seeing that led them to such extreme conclusions?
That's a crucial question because to understand them, we have to try and stand in their shoes. The economic and social transformations they were witnessing, the sudden urbanization, the new factory systems, the sheer scale of poverty alongside emerging wealth were objectively quite impressive, not to say traumatic, for those who lived through them. It truly felt like society was on the brink of an unknown future. Many contemporary observers, not just Malthus and Young, shared these deeply pessimistic views about the long-term prospects for society's wealth and class structure. It wasn't just some fringe idea, it was a widespread anxiety.
So, while Malthus was focused on the explosion of population, another giant of 19th century economics, David Ricardo, looked at something equally fundamental to the era: land. He saw a different but equally powerful force at play in shaping inequality.
Exactly. Ricardo, writing in the 1810s, observed that, unlike people, land is a finite resource. As the population grew and demand for food increased with industrialization, so too would the value of productive land. He predicted that a small, already privileged social group, the landowners, would inevitably claim a steadily increasing share of society's output and income. He based this prediction on what he called the scarcity principle.
And for anyone who hasn't encountered this scarcity principle before, it's a powerful idea. Think of it this way. If something truly essential, like, say, fertile land for growing food, or even a desirable piece of property in a booming city, is limited in supply and demand for it keeps rising, well, its price can shoot up to incredibly high levels over time. It's like everyone wanting the last golden ticket. Ricardo saw this as a potential destabilizing force for entire societies because, as he so powerfully put it, the price system knows neither limits nor morality. It doesn't care about social fairness or stability. It just reflects pure supply and demand, potentially enriching a few at the expense of many.
Now, it's interesting. Ricardo's specific prediction of ever-increasing land rents actually proved wrong in the long run. He couldn't foresee the massive technological advancements in agriculture that drastically increased food production, nor the rise of industrial growth, which, reduced agriculture's overall share of national income. Land became less central. However, his insight into the price of land is nevertheless interesting because the scarcity principle itself is still incredibly powerful and relevant today.
So even if land isn't the primary driver of scarcity today in the same way, where do we see Ricardo's principle playing out? Beyond just old farming examples.
Oh, absolutely. Well, think about urban real estate, especially in major global cities. Housing in places like New York, London, or Tokyo is a finite, highly desirable resource. As demand continues to outstrip supply, prices can rise to astronomical levels, creating housing crises and locking many people out of homeownership. Or consider essential commodities like oil or certain rare minerals if supplies are constrained. Even temporarily, the price system reacts fiercely. Ricardo's point was that when essential resources are scarce, their prices can rise without any sort of moral limit, potentially destabilizing societies if those prices rise for prolonged periods. That principle definitely still holds.
Right. Okay, moving further into the 19th century, Karl Marx took Ricardo's ideas about capital and scarcity and, well, amplified them. He spun them into an even more radical and, for many, deeply unsettling critique of capitalism itself. He wasn't just predicting problems, he was arguing they were built in.
Marx really aimed for a scientific approach. He based his work on a meticulous analysis of the internal logical contradictions of the capitalist system. He was quite keen to distinguish himself from two other prevailing camps at the time. First, the bourgeois economists of his era who, much like Adam Smith with his famous concept of the invisible hand, largely saw markets as self-regulating and capable of reaching equilibrium on their own. Second, he set himself apart from the utopian socialists, whom Marx felt merely denounced the misery of the working class without offering a truly scientific analysis of the economic processes responsible for it. Marx believed he had that systematic scientific critique.
So if Ricardo focused on land, Marx essentially applied that scarcity principle, but instead he pointed it squarely at industrial capital. We're talking about machinery, factories, the very means of production. His core idea, which he called the principle of infinite accumulation, was truly provocative, wasn't it? He argued that capital has an inexorable tendency to accumulate and concentrate in ever fewer hands with no natural limit to the process. He envisioned this future where a shrinking number of capitalists would own an ever larger share of society's productive assets, leaving the vast majority with nothing but their labor.
And this relentless tendency, as Marx saw it, led him to predict an apocalyptic end to capitalism. He didn't believe a stable system was possible under its own logic. He foresaw two possible catastrophic outcomes. Either the rate of return on capital would diminish as more and more capital accumulated, eventually killing the engine of accumulation and leading to violent conflict among capitalists, or, alternatively, capital's share of national income would increase indefinitely, which sooner or later would unite the workers in revolt against the system. In Marx's framework, there was simply no long-term socioeconomic or political equilibrium possible under capitalism. It was inherently unstable.
It's quite a vision. But I'm curious, given his deep insights, did Marx back this up with hard data? Like the kind of data we're seeing in the research we're discussing today?
That's an excellent question, and it's arguably a limitation of his work. Despite his profound conceptual insights and powerful arguments, Marx's approach to statistics was described as anecdotal and unsystematic. He didn't extensively use the robust national accounting work that was actually starting to happen around him at the time, for example, people compiling estimates of British capital stock. If he had engaged more with that empirical data, it might have helped him clarify his explanatory model and perhaps even refine his predictions with more, shall we say, rigorous empirical grounding. It's a fascinating what-if in economic history.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit then to the mid-20th century. After two devastating world wars, a new and much more optimistic idea emerged from the economic community, the Kuznets curve. This seemed to promise a more hopeful future for inequality. So what did this theory propose, and why was it so influential?
Right, Simon Kuznets. He was a pioneer in national accounts, which are really the bedrock of much of our modern economic data. He observed a compression of high U.S. incomes between 1913 and 1948. This was, as you said, a period marked by tremendous global upheaval and change. In a really significant 1955 lecture, Kuznets offered an optimistic interpretation of his findings. He suggested that economic growth over time would automatically lead to reduced inequality. This idea, proposing that inequality would naturally rise during the early stages of industrialization and then fall as an economy matured, gave rise to the widely influential Kuznets curve theory. It offered a comforting vision of progress, really.
So it painted this picture of inequality essentially solving itself as economies developed. That sounds almost magical, doesn't it? A kind of natural evolution towards fairness.
Yeah.
But was it really that simple?
Unfortunately, no. The source we're looking at points out that this theory, while optimistic, was largely formulated for the wrong reasons, with extremely fragile empirical underpinnings. The sharp reduction in income inequality that Kuznets observed in the U.S. between 1914 and 1945 was due above all to the world wars and the violent economic and political shocks they entailed. These weren't gentle, automatic processes. They were catastrophic events that specifically impacted people with large fortunes, destroying assets, raising taxes, causing inflation. The reduction in inequality had little to do with the tranquil process of intersectoral mobility described by Kuznets, which was his proposed mechanism of workers moving from low productivity agriculture to higher productivity industry. The wars were the real driver.
Wow. So the real shocker here is that the whole idea of capitalism naturally becoming more equal in the 20th century. That might just be an illusion, a blip caused by catastrophe, not evolution. Why is it so crucial for us to understand that distinction?
It's absolutely crucial because Kuznets' work, while vital for establishing national accounts, inadvertently created an illusion that capitalism had been structurally transformed after the wars. This led to a widespread belief that inequality would naturally decrease with growth, which arguably prevented deeper analysis of the underlying forces that actually drive inequality up or down. It effectively masked the true, often violent and political causes of the observed inequality reduction. If we think inequality naturally resolves itself, we might fail to implement the policies needed to truly address it, mistaking a temporary blip for a permanent trend.
Right. From these early, often grim predictions to the later, sometimes overly optimistic theories, we see this constant struggle to understand the complex forces driving wealth and its distribution. But to truly grasp what's happening, we need some precise tools and concepts to measure and analyze these dynamics. It's like needing a proper magnifying glass to really see the details. Okay, let's grab that magnifying glass. When this research talks about capital and wealth, they use the terms almost interchangeably, as we will too. But what exactly do they encompass? It's important to be clear about the definition because it's probably broader than some people might think.
That's right. When we refer to capital or wealth, we're talking about a very broad category that includes all these forms of wealth. This means tangible, physical assets like land, buildings, infrastructure, and machinery. But it also extends to what we call immaterial capital, things like patents, trademarks, and the sophisticated organizational systems that contribute to a company's overall market value. Essentially, it's anything that can be owned and has a market value assigned to it.
That makes sense. But what isn't included in this definition, and why is that exclusion significant for our understanding of inequality?
Critically, this definition excludes what's often referred to as human capital, things like your education, your skills, your capacity to perform labor. The reason for this exclusion is fundamental. In non-slave societies, human beings themselves cannot be exchanged on a market. The research clarifies that attributing a monetary value to human capital is only sensible, in an economic accounting sense, in societies with slavery, where individuals were literally owned and valued as assets. Without that horrific reality, human labor and skill are treated as distinct from capital. It's also crucial to distinguish between public and private wealth. Public wealth, which is owned by the state-think government buildings, state-owned enterprises, national parks, is currently insignificant or even negative where the public debt exceeds public assets in most developed countries today. Instead, private wealth accounts for nearly all of national wealth almost everywhere. This means the vast majority of assets and resources are privately owned by individuals and corporations.
Got it. Now, to truly understand wealth distribution and how it changes over time, we first need to understand the big picture of what a country or even the entire world produces and earns over a given period. It's like understanding the total economic pie before you can talk about how it's sliced, right?
Exactly. We use two key terms here, national income and domestic product. National income is defined as a country's domestic output plus net income from abroad. Domestic output, more commonly known as gross domestic product or GDP, is simply the total value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders. So, national income accounts for what residents of a country actually receive, whether it's from production at home or income earned from investments or work abroad. It's a total income flowing to the residents. At a global level, we have a very important accounting identity. Global income equals global output. This means that the total income generated across the entire planet must, by definition, equal the total value of new wealth produced globally. It's a closed system. All that production must then be distributed as income in one form or another. This income goes either to labor, think wages, salaries, bonuses for workers, or to capital, which includes profits, dividends, interest payments, and rents for the owners of the assets used in production. For instance, back in 2012, global output was over 70 trillion euros for nearly 7 billion people. That translates to an average global output per capita of about 10,000 euros per year, or about 760 euros per month per person if it were all equally divided. This hypothetical figure just gives us a sense of the sheer scale of global production and income and how it could be shared.
Now, here's where we bring together some of these ideas. One of the most important concepts for this deep dive is something called the capital income ratio, which is symbolized by the Greek letter beta. How does this help us measure the overall importance of capital in an economy?
This ratio is elegantly simple but profoundly informative. It measures the total capital stock, all the wealth we just defined, in years of national income. So, for example, if MEPNL equals 6, it means that a country's total capital stock, all its buildings, land, machinery, financial assets, everything, is equivalent in value to 6 years of its entire national income. It gives you a quick snapshot of how much wealth is accumulated relative to how much income the economy generates annually. It's basically a measure of how capital-intensive an economy is. Today, in most developed countries, this capital income ratio, quote, generally varies between 5 and 6. This means that if the average national income is, say, 30,000 to 35,000 euros per person per year, then the total private wealth in that country is typically somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 euros per person. That's 5 to 6 times their annual national income. There are interesting variations, though. MEPNL is greater than 6 in countries like Japan and Italy, and less than 5 in the US and Germany, showing different levels of capital accumulation relative to income across developed nations.
Okay. And complementing the capital income ratio is another crucial measure, the rate of return on capital, denoted by R. This is what capital earns for its owners, the yield it generates. Can you give us a straightforward definition?
Absolutely. Simply put, the rate of return on capital is the annual percentage return on capital invested. So if you have 100 euros of capital and it yields a 5% return, you get 5 euros back in a year. This return can come from various sources depending on the type of capital. Profits from a business, rents from property, dividends from stocks, or interest from bonds. It's important to recognize that the rates of return can vary significantly depending on where the capital is invested and the associated risk. Capital invested in a dynamic business, for instance, which often entails greater risk and entrepreneurial effort, might yield a higher average return, typically around 6–8% before taxes. Other, less risky forms of capital, like simple savings accounts or government bonds, often yield much less. It's also crucial to note that interest is a specific, often lower form of return compared to the overall profits, rents, and dividends that capital can generate across an entire economy. Captures the average return across all forms of capital.
So what does this all mean when we put these pieces together? These concepts, the capital income ratio and the rate of return on capital law, are deeply interconnected through a core relationship, what the research calls the first fundamental law of capitalism.
Right. This law is elegantly expressed by the formula O equals RA. Here, the Greek letter alpha, AA, represents the share of income from capital in national income. In plain language, this formula tells us how much of a country's total annual income is going to the owners of capital, as opposed to going to labor in the form of wages. It's a snapshot of the balance between capital and labor in generating and distributing a nation's wealth.
Let's walk through a quick example to make this really concrete for our listener, just to see how it works.
Certainly. Let's say a country's capital income ratio is 600%, meaning its total capital stock is 6 times its national income. And let's say the average annual rate of return on that capital R is 5%. Then, according to the formula, IH is RA. So IA equals 5% multiplied by 600%, which equals 30%. This means that 30% of that country's national income is derived from capital, profits, rents, dividends, etc. The remaining 70% would typically go to labor in the form of wages and salaries. This simple yet powerful formula allows us to analyze the importance of capital for an entire country or even the planet, illustrating how the stock of capital relates to the flow of income it generates year after year. It's a really fundamental relationship.
Okay, now, when we're comparing incomes and economic outputs across different countries, the raw numbers can be incredibly tricky and sometimes misleading. We often hear about exchange rates, but this deep dive emphasizes something else entirely, called purchasing power parity, or PPP. Why should we care about this distinction? It sounds a bit technical.
It does sound technical, but it's vital for accurate global comparisons. Current exchange rates, like saying €1 is worth $1.30, simply tell you how much foreign currency you get for your money on the international market. However, purchasing power parity, PPP, goes a step further. It adjusts for the actual cost of goods and services in different countries. It essentially asks, what can your money actually buy in each place, regardless of the exchange rate?
So, if I understand correctly, it's about real buying power. If I have €1,000 and the exchange rate might give me $1,300. But if everything in Europe is more expensive, say 10% more than in the US, then my €1,000 in Europe doesn't feel like $1,300 in terms of what it can buy. It feels more like maybe $1,200 of purchasing power in US terms. Is that the idea?
You've got it precisely. It's about what your money can do for you in your local economy, where you usually spend it. We use PPP to compare the GDP of different countries on the basis of the actual purchasing power of their citizens, who generally spend their income at home rather than abroad. If you only use exchange rates, you can significantly overstate or understate global inequality and the actual living standards in different nations. PPP allows for a much more accurate apples-to-apples comparison of people's real economic well-being across borders. It's crucial for getting the picture right. Now, a word about the data itself, because the scale is immense. The historical data series used for this extensive research are regularly updated and at this writing extend to the early 2010s. Gathering and harmonizing such a vast amount of information across centuries and different countries is frankly a monumental task. For income data, specific deciles and centiles of high incomes, meaning the top 10% and top 1% of earners, were meticulously estimated from tax data based on stated incomes. These figures were then carefully corrected in various ways to ensure comparability across different time periods and geographic regions, even when tax laws changed over time. National income and average income figures were primarily derived from national accounts, and where historical records were incomplete, these were carefully estimated or extended using various methods. Generally, these robust data series began when income tax was first established in each country, which was typically between 1910 and 1920, though some countries like Japan and Germany started earlier in the 1880s. For wealth data, which gives us a direct look at accumulated assets, 3 distinct types of historical data and methodology were employed, each complementing the others. First, estate tax returns, similar to income tax data, allowed researchers to study changes in wealth inequality over generations by looking at what people left behind when they died. This approach was pioneered by Robert Lampman for the U.S. back in 1962 and by Atkinson and Harrison for the U.K. in 1978. In some cases, like France, estate tax data extends much further back, often to the beginning of the 19th century, providing a very long view. Second, wealth surveys, or annual wealth taxes on the living, which have been used in Nordic countries and France between 1990 and 2010, helped validate the estimates derived from estate data. And finally, national accounts data was used for overall capital stock values, providing a macroeconomic perspective on total wealth.
That's an incredible amount of information to pull together across so much time and space. What were some of the biggest challenges in making sense of centuries of financial records and government data? It can't have been easy.
No, definitely not. It's crucial to understand that these figures are always rough estimates, not mathematical certainties. This is due to several factors. Fluctuating market prices for assets, think housing bubbles or stock market crashes, the inherent difficulties in harmonizing data across vastly different historical contexts and legal systems, and sometimes simply incomplete records. Especially for the 18th and 19th centuries, the existence of mixed incomes, where income derived partly from capital and partly from labor, like for a small farmer or shop owner, makes clear distinctions difficult, leading to approximations in these historical estimates. Despite these challenges, the effort to combine and cross-reference multiple data sources makes these estimates remarkably robust and gives us the most comprehensive picture we've ever had of long-run wealth and income dynamics.
Right. Now that we have our toolkit of concepts, beta R, alpha, PPP, and an understanding of the immense data that underpins this research, let's dive into what the research actually reveals about how wealth has flowed through history and the powerful forces that shape it. This is where the story of economic dynamics really comes alive. Okay, so the research highlights this fundamental tension, almost a constant tug-of-war, that has shaped economic history for centuries. Mechanisms that push towards greater equality, and those that pull strongly in the opposite direction, towards greater inequality.
That's a perfect way to describe it. Let's look at the convergence forces first, those that tend to reduce inequality over time. The main drivers here are identified as the diffusion of knowledge and investment in training and skills. While the basic law of supply and demand for capital and labor also plays a role, its influence is often less powerful and sometimes even ambiguous in the long run. Ultimately, it's knowledge and skill diffusion, the spread of education, technology, and know-how that is the key to overall productivity growth and the reduction of inequality, both within and between countries.
So a country like China catching up economically over the last few decades, that's a prime example of this knowledge diffusion at work.
Exactly. We see this vividly in the advances made by many previously poor countries, led by China, as they catch up with advanced economies by adopting new modes of production, investing heavily in education, and acquiring comparable skills. This process is fundamentally about sharing knowledge, which the research calls the public good par excellence, meaning everyone benefits from it, and one person's use of knowledge doesn't diminish another's ability to use it too. It's a powerful equalizing force, potentially. But then on the other side, we have divergence forces, those that push towards greater inequality. And the research suggests there is no natural, spontaneous process to prevent destabilizing, inegalitarian forces from prevailing permanently. It doesn't just fix itself. One profoundly significant force, which we'll delve into much more, is the difference between the rate of return on capital, R, and the economic growth rate, PD. When R is significantly greater than G, it creates a powerful engine for wealth concentration. Another crucial factor is demographics. Stagnant, or worse, decreasing population increases the influence of capital accumulated in previous generations simply because there are fewer new people and less new economic activity to dilute the relative importance of existing wealth. This leads us to some interesting demographic differences between the old world of Europe and the new world of America. High demographic growth, as seen historically in the New World, think of the United States with its waves of immigrants, tends to reduce the importance of inherited wealth. New generations are constantly expanding the labor pool and creating new wealth, making existing fortunes relatively less dominant over time. In contrast, the French case is more typical and more pertinent for understanding the future because its demographic growth slowed much earlier. This made inherited wealth a more significant factor in overall wealth distribution for longer, a pattern we might see replicated elsewhere in the 21st century if population growth slows globally.
What's truly fascinating here, looking at the data, is this dramatic historical pattern, almost like a giant U-shaped curve, for the capital-to-income ratio. It shows that the total value of capital relative to national income has gone through some absolutely enormous shifts over the last century or so. It certainly wasn't a straight line.
Absolutely. The 20th century disruption was immense and, frankly, violent. The capital income ratio, remember the total wealth compared to annual income, fell by nearly 2/3 between 1914 and 1945. This disappeared capital wasn't just an economic adjustment. It was directly due to violent military, political, and economic conflicts. Key factors included the collapse of foreign portfolios held by European powers, making colonial investments worthless, very low savings rates during those tumultuous times, massive physical destruction of infrastructure and property during the wars, and crucially, low asset prices that obtained in the new post-war political context of mixed ownership and regulation. Basically, the market value of almost everything plummeted and stayed low for decades. But then, after 1945, came this remarkable comeback. The capital income ratio more than doubled in the period 1945-2012. This means that wealth is once again flourishing and, as the research suggests, is about to return to levels equal to those observed in the 18th and 19th centuries. This strong comeback of private capital signals what the research calls the emergence of a new patrimonial capitalism, where inherited wealth and existing capital play an increasingly dominant role, potentially similar in structure, though not identical, to pre-World War I societies.
So it's almost like a return to an older form of capitalism in some ways. But despite these massive shifts, you're saying that over the very long term, the total value of capital stock relative to national income hasn't actually changed all that much in some places. That sounds really counterintuitive after everything we just heard about the wars destroying so much wealth.
It is indeed. Despite these very large swings and dramatic changes in the capital income ratio, it's a profound observation that in countries with very long data series like Britain and France, the total value of capital stock, when measured in years of national income, appears not to have changed very much over a very long period of time. It hovered around 5–7 years of national income back then, and it's roughly back in that range now. What has changed, however, is the nature of that capital. It was once predominantly agricultural land, then significant foreign assets, and now it's largely industrial capital, financial assets, and urban real estate. So the underlying structure of wealth has been totally transformed, even if the aggregate ratio, surprisingly, shows long-term stability.
It's hard to talk about wealth and income without talking about money itself and how its value changes. How money was perceived and its stability over time seems to play a huge role in all of this. What stands out to you about the difference between the 19th and 20th centuries in terms of monetary stability?
Oh, it's one of the most striking differences, really. The 18th and 19th century stability of monetary conditions was remarkable. Inflation was practically zero in the 18th and 19th centuries. This meant that monetary references, how much income represented a certain lifestyle or social status, were incredibly stable and predictable, not just for a decade, but for generations. People knew what a certain sum of money meant.
You can actually see this perfectly illustrated in classic literature, can't you? Think of Jane Austen's novels, set in early 19th century Britain, or Honoré de Balzac's in post-Napoleonic France. Money was everywhere in these novels, not just as an abstract force, but palpable, concrete. Authors would frequently specify characters' incomes, for instance. 500 to 1,000 pounds a year in Austen's world was considered comfortable, while 10,000 to 20,000 francs was needed for decency and Balzac's Père Goriot. This wasn't just literary flavor. It was because everyone knew what standard of living these numbers represented. These monetary markers were stable, allowing readers to instantly grasp a character's social standing and prospects.
Then the 20th century rupture couldn't be more stark. Inflation became high, with an average of 2% a year since 1990 in many countries, and much, much higher in earlier decades of the century. This sustained increase meant a profound loss of stable monetary reference points and marks a significant break with previous centuries. As a consequence, money virtually disappeared from literature after the shocks of 1914–1945. Writers like Naguib Mahfouz, writing about pre-inflation Cairo, still use specific incomes to ground his characters, much like Balzac. But in later novels, like those of Orhan Pamuk, set in inflation-prone Istanbul of the 1970s, discussing money became tedious even for the characters themselves, reflecting a society where monetary values were constantly shifting and ambiguous. It lost its fixed meaning. And this inflation's role in the dynamics of wealth distribution is significant. Historically, inflation was essentially how most large public debts have been dealt with, like after the World Wars, effectively wiping out the real value of government debt held by bondholders. But it also leads to chaotic, uncontrolled redistributions of wealth among social groups, as some assets, like real estate, and incomes are better protected from rising prices than others, like cash savings or fixed pensions, often creating winners and losers arbitrarily.
Right. We often instinctively think of capital as purely private, something owned by individuals or corporations. But the line between public and private wealth has shifted dramatically over centuries, revealing a truly fascinating historical journey of who owns what.
Indeed. Consider historical public debt. Both Britain and France, for example, had amassed very large public debts in the 18th century, reaching up to 100% of national income by the 1760s and 1770s, largely due to constant wars. This historical context helps us understand why 19th century socialists, notably Marx, were wary of public debt, which they saw as a tool of private capital, enriching bondholders, often the already wealthy, at the public's expense through interest payments. Then came the 20th century reversal and privatization, bringing immense shifts. The economic shocks of 1914–1945, the Great Depression, and two world wars shifted focus away from national wealth estimates toward simply measuring economic output, GDP. During this period, private capital seemed to have evaporated as asset prices fell to extremely low levels and stayed there. Governments like Germany's dramatically reduced their public debt by drowning it in inflation, with prices multiplying by an incredible 300 times between 1930 and 1950. It was a brutal way to clear the slate. Following these upheavals, in the post-war public ownership era from roughly 1950 to 1980, countries like Germany and France saw a significant rise in public capital. For example, Germany's net public capital reached almost 1 year's national income, meaning the state owned 25–30% of Germany's national capital. This reflected a period of extensive state intervention and ownership in key industries and services, a truly mixed economy model.
So the state actually owned a substantial chunk of the economy for a while there. But then it shifted back again. What drove that?
Exactly. This eventually led to a return to private dominance. The slowdown in economic growth after the boom years of the 1970s, coupled with accumulating public debt in many countries, resulted in a complete turnaround over the course of the past few decades. By 2010, net public wealth in many developed countries had returned to almost exactly zero, sometimes even negative, with private wealth accounting for nearly all of national wealth. This shift was also driven significantly by waves of privatization or gradual transfer of public wealth into private hands, often significantly at notoriously low prices, which made these sales politically popular with buyers and helped boost private wealth figures. The most extensive privatization of this kind, in fact, occurred in the former Soviet bloc countries after the fall of communism in the 1990s, creating vast new private fortunes almost overnight.
Fascinating. Now, when we compare wealth dynamics in old Europe with the New World of America, we see some truly unique factors at play, especially in how capital was valued and accumulated. It wasn't a simple case of one continent replicating the other, was it?
Not at all. Around the time of U.S. independence, between 1770 and 1810, the U.S. capital income ratio was scarcely more than 3 years of national income, which was significantly lower than in Britain or France, where it was around 7 years. This was partly because, quite simply, land was so abundant that it did not cost very much in the vast expanses of the New World. It was a continent perceived as waiting to be settled and exploited. However, this picture is horribly incomplete without considering the monstrous role of slavery. In the American South during the same period, 1770 to 1810, the market value of slaves was about 1.5 years of U.S. national income, remarkably, as much as the value of all the agricultural land in the entire country. When this horrific form of capital enslaved human beings is combined with land value, the research finds that Southern slave owners controlled more wealth than the landlords of old Europe. This dramatically altered the wealth landscape, making the South a very different and far more unequal economic entity than the North. This led to starkly divergent realities within the New World itself. The North was a relatively egalitarian society among its white population, with low overall capital value due to abundant land and a population largely made up of recent immigrants who hadn't had time to accumulate much wealth. The South, by stark contrast, was a world where inequalities of ownership took the most extreme and violent form possible, since one half of the population owned the other half. Here, slave capital largely supplanted and surpassed landed capital. This unique and profoundly unequal structure in the South significantly distorted any simple comparison to Europe and shaped American inequality for centuries. Furthermore, the demographic growth of the New World, the constant influx of new populations through immigration, ensured that inherited wealth played a smaller role there overall than in Europe. The new arrivals diluted the relative importance of older inherited fortunes, leading to peculiar inequality structures in the U.S. that aren't easily generalizable to other parts of the world. It was a truly distinct economic journey, deeply marked by both opportunity and brutal exploitation.
So what does this all mean for our current economic era? The period from 1970 to 2010 saw a truly significant resurgence of private capital, ushering in what's being called a new patrimonial capitalism. This sounds like the rich getting richer again, potentially through inheritance.
Indeed, we've seen a striking comeback of private capital across all rich countries. In the early 1970s, private wealth, net of debt, ranged from between 2 and 3.5 years of national income. By 2010, this had dramatically risen to between 4 and 7 years of national income. This shows a clear and widespread reaccumulation of private assets across the developed world, a real shift in the balance backed towards capital. This rebound is largely explained by a fundamental dynamic law, which you might recall from earlier. J is the capital income ratio, S is the savings rate, the proportion of income saved each year, and G is the growth rate of the economy, which is the sum of population growth and per capita output growth.
Right. Let's use that excellent bathtub analogy again to really nail down this OAVSEG law for everyone listening. Imagine you're filling a bathtub. The water level in the tub represents your total capital stock. The rate at which you turn on the faucet is your savings rate, how quickly you're adding new capital water into the economy. Now imagine there's a leak or some evaporation from the tub. That represents the growth rate. G, new income and population growth kind of uses up or dilutes the existing capital. So if you keep filling at a steady rate at G and EVS, but the water evaporates or leaks out slower, G decreases, the water level in the tub will inevitably rise over time, won't it?
That's a perfect way to visualize it. Applying this analogy, the research shows that since 1970, slower growth coupled with continued high savings especially in Europe and Japan, which had much lower population growth rates than the U.S., explains a significant portion of the rise in gap. When the economy grows slowly, Gaddy's low, existing capital looms larger relative to new income, so gas rises, assuming savings remain reasonably high. This period also saw the privatization or gradual transfer of public wealth into private hands, as we discussed, further contributing to private capital accumulation, adding to EPS effectively. Additionally, there was a catch-up of asset prices like stocks and real estate that compensated for their decline between 1910 and 1950, further boosting the measured value of private wealth. It's important to understand the role of asset prices here. While movements in real estate and the stock market prices always dominate in the short and even medium run, creating bubbles and crashes that grab headlines, over the long run, volume effects, meaning the fundamental rates of savings and growth, are decisive in determining the capital income ratio. However, asset prices themselves are not purely economic phenomena. They are also a social and political construct, heavily influenced by a myriad of laws, regulations, tax policies, and societal norms that determine how we value different types of property and investments. It's not just a detached market force operating in a vacuum.
Right. The return of these high capital income ratios certainly raises big questions about inequality among individuals. After all, who actually owns all this resurgent capital? Let's shift our focus now to who owns what, who earns what, and what that tells us about the structure of our societies today. It's about dissecting inequality at a personal level. When we talk about inequality, it's crucial to remember it's not a single, simple thing. It's a complex tapestry, really, woven from different sources with distinct implications. We can't just look at one number, like the Gini coefficient, and understand the whole picture.
Precisely. The research brilliantly decomposes income inequality into three key components. First, there's inequality in income from labor, which includes wages, salaries, bonuses, basically how much you earn from working. Second, there's inequality in the ownership of capital and the income it generates, such as profits, rents, dividends, interest, how much you earn from your assets. And third, there's the interaction between these two sources, how labor income relates to capital ownership for different individuals. It's essential to distinguish between these because their justification is quite different for moral and normative reasons. We tend to think differently about inequality from effort versus inheritance, and also the economic, social, and political mechanisms capable of explaining the observed evolutions are totally distinct. Different forces drive wage gaps compared to wealth concentration.
This distinction reminds me of Balzac's 19th century novel, Père Goriot, and the famous Rastignac's dilemma. Eugene de Rastignac, remember, is a poor but ambitious law student who arrives in cynical Parisian society and quickly learns a brutal lesson about wealth. He discovers that a top 1% inheritance could afford him 25 zony domestic servants for life, the ultimate symbol of comfort and status back then. In stark contrast, even a top 1% job, like becoming a royal prosecutor, which paid about 10 times the lower class standard, was seen by society's elite as a symbol of mediocrity compared to the effortlessly acquired wealth of an inherited fortune. This anecdote perfectly highlights that stark choice presented to him. Years of hard work with limited, albeit good, returns versus the immense power and status conferred by inherited fortune. It was almost a no-brainer which path led to true societal power.
It's a perfect illustration of how the structure of inequality shapes individual choices and perceptions. And to understand how these hierarchies operate today, the research uses precise terms like deciles and centiles. We hear a lot about the 1%, but this research gives us a precise way to define these groups and track how their share of wealth and income has changed over time. These terms are crucial for comparison. The top centile refers to the richest 1% of the population, and the top decile refers to the richest 10%. These groups are large enough to exert a significant influence on both the social landscape and the political and economic order, making their dynamics critical to understanding overall inequality. To give you a concrete example of wealth distribution, if the richest 10% of the population owns 60% of total wealth, which is typical in many European countries today, it means that each member of this group owns, on average, 6 times the average wealth of society. But within that top 10%, the inequality is often even more extreme. The top 1% might own 25% of total wealth, making them on average 25 times richer than the average person. Meanwhile, the next 9% of that top decile, sometimes called the upper middle class of wealth, are barely 4 times richer than the average. This illustrates a severe concentration right at the very top of the wealth pyramid. It's also really important to remember that the hierarchies, and therefore centiles and deciles of income, are not the same as those of wealth. The 1% who earn the most from their labor in a given year are not necessarily the exact same individuals as the 1% who own the most capital. While this correlation is generally positive but never perfect, meaning high earners often also own a lot of wealth and vice versa, there are significant distinctions. Some might be high earners saving furiously but haven't yet accumulated vast wealth, while others might have modest incomes but live comfortably off large inherited fortunes. So social inequality is truly multidimensional.
Okay, let's dig into the labor side first. What determined how much people earn from their labor? It seems intuitive that education and technology play a significant role, but the research unpacks this with more nuance, doesn't it? What are the core drivers of wage inequality?
Well, the traditional marginal productivity theory suggests that wages are closely linked to an individual's productivity. You get paid what you contribute. While the research notes this theory can be simplistic and hard to measure in practice, it does emphasize two social and economic forces that play a fundamental role in determining wage inequality: the supply and demand of skills. The supply of skills, naturally, depends on the state of the educational system, how many people get access to quality training and education at various levels. The demand for skills depends on the state of the technologies available and what kinds of jobs a society needs to produce its goods and services. Are we needing more software engineers or more factory workers, for example? But it's not just about skills. The minimum wage also plays a crucial role in wage setting, often acting as a floor that influences wages even for those earning slightly above it. Consider the striking U.S. versus France example. The U.S. federal minimum wage reached its peak purchasing power back in 1969 at $10.10 in 2013, but then stagnated for decades, falling significantly in real terms. By 2013, it had fallen a third below the French minimum wage, which had steadily risen over time, partly indexed to average wage growth. Interestingly, studies in the U.S. between 1980 and 2000 actually showed that the minimum wage had fallen to such a low level relative to average wages that it could likely be raised without causing significant job losses, challenging the simplest supply-demand models. This suggests that the minimum wage isn't just about pure market forces. It's a policy choice with real impact on the lower end of the wage spectrum and overall inequality. There's also the specific investments argument for things like minimum wages or fixed pay scales. These can protect the specific investments workers make in a particular firm like learning, unique methods, or internal organizational systems that aren't easily transferable elsewhere. If wages could be cut unilaterally by the employer, workers would be less incentivized to make these valuable firm-specific investments. So setting pay scales in advance can actually encourage worker commitment and be in everyone's long-term interest. Ultimately, though, the research concludes that the best way to increase wages and reduce wage inequalities in the long run is to invest in education and skills for the entire workforce, making people more productive and adaptable.
Okay, that covers the broad wage structure. But one of the most striking trends in recent decades, especially in some countries, is the explosion of very high salaries, particularly for what the research calls supermanagers, CEOs, and top executives. What's truly fascinating here is that it's not a universal trend across the developed world. Why the difference?
That's a key observation, and it directly challenges some common assumptions about globalization and technology driving all wage trends. The rise of the supermanager, with their often stratospheric pay packages, is largely an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon. Since about 1980, the share of national income going to the top centile, the top 1% of earners, has risen significantly in the United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia. In the early 2010s, the U.S. top centile share reached nearly 20% of national income, which is dramatically higher than the 14-15% in Britain and Canada and 9-10% in Australia. These are huge slices of the national pie going to a tiny group.
So if it were purely about some global technological shift, making top managers incredibly more productive everywhere, or a war for talent driven by globalization, you'd expect to see this happening everywhere, right? But continental Europe and Japan didn't follow the same extreme path.
Precisely. In contrast with continental Europe and Japan, the top centile's share of national income in these countries has increased much less. For example, Japan and France saw only modest increases, from around 7% to about 9%, and Germany from about 9% to 11% over the same period. This clear divergence casts doubt on any explanation based solely on objective inequalities of productivity. If it were purely about technological change increasing the value of certain top-level skills, we would expect to see similar trends across all similarly advanced economies. The fact that we don't strongly suggest something else is at play, likely related to institutions, norms, and policy choices. Instead, research suggests that skyrocketing executive pay is fairly well explained by the bargaining model. This model posits that lower marginal tax rates, meaning the top earners get to keep a larger share of each additional dollar they earn, provide a strong incentive for executives to negotiate harder for higher pay. They have more personal gain at stake when taxes are lower. The research suggests it's potentially more apt to think of this phenomenon as executives having their hands in the till, leveraging their position to extract more compensation rather than being solely driven by Adam Smith's invisible hand, reflecting their true marginal product. This is especially plausible given the highly imperfect information available for objectively assessing individual contributions to a large firm's output. There's a lot of discretion and power dynamics involved in setting top pay.
Okay, that's the income side. So what does this all mean for the other fundamental driver of inequality? Wealth itself, and especially inherited wealth. Perhaps the most profound insight from this research, the one that ties so much together, is the relationship between the rate of return on capital, R, and the economic growth rate, G. This dynamic, RG, seems to profoundly fuel inherited wealth over earned income.
This is truly a cornerstone of the research, yes. Traditionally, economists like Franco Modigliani theorized with what's called the life cycle theory of savings. This idea suggested that people primarily save during their working lives to finance their retirement, and then they consume their accumulated capital in old age, ideally dying with little or no accumulated wealth to pass on. The implication of this theory was that inequality of wealth would be a simple translation in time of inequality of income from labor, meaning wealth differences just reflected age and past earnings differences, and thus wealth inequality itself would be of limited importance in the broader scheme of social inequality. It presented a fairly optimistic picture where hard work during life, not inheritance, was the main determinant of financial standing.
But the data tells a very, very different story, doesn't it? It suggests people aren't just saving for retirement and then spending it all down. There's more going on.
It absolutely does. The data directly contradicts the simplest version of Modigliani's theory. For instance, in France, where long historical data exists, the research shows that the dead have always been, on average, wealthier than the living, except for a brief period right around World War II when wealth was destroyed. This stark fact indicates that people accumulate wealth not just to finance their own retirement, but significantly to perpetuate the family fortune. They aim to pass wealth down. The portion of wealth that is annuitized, meaning it's consumed during life and cannot be passed on to descendants, like certain pensions, is actually a very small fraction of total private wealth, underscoring the enduring desire to transmit assets across generations. This brings us right to the core RG mechanism. When the rate of return on capital, R, is distinctly greater than the growth rate, R, of the overall economy, accumulated wealth grows faster than output and income. This means that capital, especially large fortunes that can be diversified and managed professionally to achieve higher returns, tends to expand at a quicker pace than the economy's ability to create new wealth or for wages to increase for the average worker. This dynamic automatically bestows outsized importance on inequalities of wealth accumulated in the past, simply because existing wealth is compounding faster than new earnings can keep up.
So this isn't just an abstract formula. It's presented as the fundamental reason why inherited wealth can inherently outpace earned income, fundamentally reshaping social hierarchies over time. If your capital, say a significant inheritance, grows at 5% a year through investments, a plausible long-term R, but the overall economy, and thus average wages, only grows at 1% or 2% a year, your inherited wealth will rapidly pull away from any income you could possibly earn through your labor alone. Over time, this makes it easier for the elderly to acquire most of the available assets, not necessarily because they saved more diligently, but simply because their existing capital is multiplying faster than the working population's ability to save or increase their income. It sounds like a built-in advantage for those who start with capital, especially in low-growth environments.
Exactly. This RG mechanism helps explain why capital-dominated societies, those with social hierarchies largely determined by inherited wealth, much like 19th century Europe as depicted by Balzac and Austen, tend to arise and subsist primarily in low-growth regimes. When overall economic growth is slow, the power of the return on existing capital becomes paramount, almost inexorable in driving inequality. We can see this vividly by looking at inheritance versus work, changing life choices in France from 1790 to 2030, which offers a striking historical comparison based on the data. In the 19th century, the wealthiest 1% of heirs had lifetime resources 25-30 times greater than the average resources of the lower class, enough inherited wealth to comfortably employ 25-30 domestic servants for life without working. At the same time, even the best 1% of jobs, like a judge or top government official, afforded only about 10 times the lower class standard. In that era, inheritance clearly dominated work, making it a far more appealing path to a comfortable life, perhaps the only path to true affluence and high social standing for most. Then, for the generations born in the mid-20th century, specifically the cohort born around 1910-1920 who came of age after the wars, a dramatic shift occurred. Due to the destruction of capital during the wars and the subsequent high economic growth rates, G was high, or express, the top 1% of inheritances afforded only barely 5 times the lower class standard. Meanwhile, the best jobs still afforded 10-12 times that standard. For arguably the first time in history, study, work, and talent paid better than inheritance. This fundamentally altered individual life choices and societal incentives, creating an era where meritocracy felt much more real and attainable for many. Looking ahead, however, with a probable return to a low-growth regime in the 21st century, low G, inherited wealth will make a comeback. The research suggests that the natural structure of inequality seems rather to favor a domination of rentiers over managers, meaning those who simply live off capital income could once again tend to outrank those who earn high labor incomes through work. This implies a potential reversal of the mid-20th century trend back towards a structure more reminiscent of the 19th century.
Wow. So we've just explored how inherited wealth, fueled by RG, seems poised for a powerful comeback. But how concentrated is wealth today compared to the extreme hyper-concentration of the past, like the Belle Epoque before the World Wars? Is it the same old story playing out again, or has something fundamentally changed in the structure of wealth ownership?
That's a critical distinction, and the research suggests it's not a simple return to the past, at least not yet. The concentration of wealth has never fully recovered from the shocks of 1914-1945. For instance, in France, the top decile's top 10% share of total wealth plummeted from around 90% in 1910-1920 to about 60-70% in 1950-1970. The top centile's top 1% share dropped even more drastically, from roughly 60% of all wealth before WWI to just 20-30% after WWII. This represents a clear and overwhelming break with the pre-war past. The very wealthy certainly still existed, but they held a significantly smaller share of the total economic pie. The essential difference today compared to 1910 is the emergence of a patrimonial middle class. This group, broadly the middle 40% of the wealth distribution from the 50th to the 90th percentile, now owns about a third of national wealth in many countries. This represents a major social transformation compared to the past when the poorest half of society owned almost nothing and the middle 40% owned very little either, maybe 5-10%. So while wealth is still highly concentrated at the very top, the top 10% own maybe 60-70% today and the top 1% maybe 25-30%, this broader, they're still unequal distribution means it's not quite the extreme hyper-concentration of the past where the top 1% held the vast majority. More people own some assets, like houses, even if the top continues to dominate significantly. When we look at the US versus Europe historical context, we see interesting parallels and divergences. Early 20th century US wealth inequality was high, with the top decile owning about 80% and the top centile around 45% of total wealth. However, this was markedly lower than in Europe at the time, where the top decile often controlled 90% and the top centile 60%. Interestingly, Americans at the time were alarmed by their growing inequality, fearing they were losing their pioneering egalitarian spirit and becoming too much like stratified, class-bound old Europe. The perception of inequality matters as much as the numbers sometimes.
But we know that wealth inequality did start to rise again post-1970-80 in many countries, including the US, sometimes dramatically. So is it just a matter of time before it returns to those extreme pre-WWI levels, or have there been structural changes like this patrimonial middle class that might prevent it from fully recovering to that point?
That's precisely the unfinished story the research leaves us with. Wealth inequality did start to rise again post-1970-80 in many countries, and is still on an upward trajectory in most places. The fundamental question remains whether the shocks of the 20th century were merely a temporary pause in a longer underlying trend towards high concentration driven by RG, and if not enough time has passed since 1945 for wealth to fully return to past heights. Or alternatively, has there been a more structural change, like the rise of the patrimonial middle class, different social norms, or the social state itself, that might prevent that extreme concentration from fully recovering? The future in this respect is still being written, and it depends heavily on the choices societies make regarding policy and institutions.
Right. So given these deep historical trends and the powerful mechanisms of wealth accumulation like KNRG, what can societies actually do to regulate capital and address inequality in the 21st century? This brings us to a crucial discussion about policies and challenges. What levers do we actually have? The 20th century saw an absolutely enormous expansion of the role of government, particularly in social spending, things like public education, healthcare, pensions. This created what we now often refer to as the social state. Can you help us understand the sheer scale of this transformation? It was massive, wasn't it?
It was immense, truly transformative. Between roughly 1920 and 1980, the share of national income that wealthy countries devoted to social spending and taxes increased by a factor of at least 3 or 4 bumps. And in the Nordic countries, it was even more, multiplying by more than 5 times. This was a fundamental change in the nature of the state, as rich countries shifted from having less than 10% of national income consumed by taxes and social transfers to reaching a new equilibrium in which the figure rose to between a third and a half of national income. This era saw the creation and massive expansion of public education systems, universal health systems, and social security programs like pensions and unemployment benefits. After 1980, however, the tax share stabilized everywhere, though at different levels reflecting different social contracts. Around 30% of national income in the U.S., about 40% in Britain, and between 45% and 55% in continental Europe, like 50% in France. This stabilization marked a new phase, no longer the dramatic upward climb of earlier decades, but rather debates about efficiency and sustainability at these new, higher levels.
So is the state's role now essentially fixed? Or could it expand further? And why does this expansion of government spending matter so much for our everyday lives and living standards?
Well, the research suggests that the state's great leap forward has already taken place. There will be no second leap, not like the first one in any event. Doubling the size of the state again seems unlikely. However, a functioning state, even today, needs a minimum of 10–15% of national income in tax receipts just to provide basic public services beyond the core regalian responsibilities like police, justice, and defense. Crucially, education and health alone account for a significant portion, often more than 20% of GDP in advanced countries, and represent the most tangible and impressive improvement in standards of living over the past 2 centuries, contributing to everything from longer life expectancies to widespread literacy and economic opportunity. These are the foundations of modern developed societies, built largely through public spending. Modern social states are fundamentally founded on rights-based approaches to things like education, health, and pensions, the idea that citizens have a right to these basic services. However, this inevitably raises a central tension. How far do equal rights extend? Should everyone get the exact same level of service, or are inequalities acceptable? And how do societies balance these abstract principles of social justice with the very real inequalities that persist in income, wealth, and access? These questions are constantly debated and reevaluated through democratic deliberations, shaping the ongoing evolution of the social contract.
Okay, let's talk about one of the most powerful tools societies have used historically to specifically address inequality, particularly in the 20th century. Progressive taxation. This is the idea that higher earners should pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes. How did this idea develop, and what was its impact according to the research?
Indeed, the major 20th century innovation in taxation was the creation and development of the progressive income tax, alongside the progressive estate tax, a tax on large inherited wealth. These were absolutely crucial instruments in the observed reduction of inequality during the mid-20th century, directly redistributing wealth and income and, perhaps just as importantly, curbing the accumulation of extreme fortunes at the very top. Let's look at the historical context in France, for example. The 1914 income tax began with a mere 2% top rate, almost symbolic, but the chaos and crushing debt following World War I pushed it rapidly to what we consider modern levels. The top rate hit 50% in 1920 and even 72% in 1925. What's particularly striking is that these very high rates were adopted even by supposedly conservative right-wing governments facing a disastrous financial situation and needing revenue desperately. And importantly, the memory of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was fresh in everyone's mind, providing a powerful political incentive to address inequality and raise revenue to rebuild society and prevent further unrest. Fear played a role.
So fear of social unrest actually drove these high tax rates in some cases, not just some abstract economic principle. And how did this compare globally? Did everyone adopt these high progressive rates, or was there variation?
Oh, there was huge variation, especially later on. This contrasts sharply with what the research calls the Anglo-Saxon yo-yo versus continental Europe's stability in top tax rates. The US and Britain experienced a great passion for equality from the 1930s through the 1970s, implementing very high top marginal income tax rates, often reaching 80–90% or even more on the very highest incomes. Then, starting around 1980, they veered off with equal enthusiasm in the opposite direction, dramatically dropping top rates down to 30–40%, with Reagan's 1986 reform famously setting the top rate at just 28%. Continental Europe and Japan, however, largely held steady, with top rates remaining around 50–60% throughout this period, showing much less fluctuation. The impact of tax cuts on inequality seems quite clear in the data presented. The research shows a close relationship, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon countries, between the sharp decrease in top marginal tax rates and the sharp increase in the top centile share of national income, especially income derived from executive remuneration. This strongly supports the bargaining model of executive pay we discussed earlier. Lower marginal tax rates provide a greater incentive for executives to negotiate aggressively for higher pre-tax pay, effectively increasing their take-home pay and contributing to rising top income shares, rather than necessarily reflecting a genuine surge in their productivity or contribution to society. Taxes shape incentives.
Okay, so what does this all mean for the future, especially given the dynamics of Churji and the comeback of inherited wealth we've discussed? The research proposes a bold and, let's be honest, for many, quite controversial solution. A global progressive tax on capital. This sounds revolutionary, maybe even a little utopian.
It's certainly ambitious, no doubt about it. The rationale behind this proposal is that it's seen by the author as the ideal policy for avoiding an endless inegalitarian spiral and regaining control over the dynamics of accumulation. Such a tax, it's argued, would expose wealth to democratic scrutiny, promote the general interest over private interests by limiting extreme concentration, and simultaneously preserve economic openness and the forces of competition, unlike, say, crude protectionism. It's also proposed as the main justification for a progressive annual tax on the largest fortunes worldwide, specifically to control the potentially explosive process where large fortunes, like those of Bill Gates or Lillian Bettencourt mentioned in the text, grew at staggering rates of over 13% annually between 1990 and 2010, far exceeding the general economic growth rate. This kind of divergence, where RG for the wealthiest, can lead to extreme, potentially destabilizing concentration if unchecked.
And how exactly would this kind of tax work in practice? Is it like the property tax we pay on our homes or something different?
It's quite different. How it works would involve an annual tax on individual wealth. That is, the net value of all assets a person controls minus their debts. Proposed rates in the research are illustrative. Maybe 0% for net assets below 1 million euros, 1% on wealth between 1 and 5 million euros, and 2% on wealth above 5 million euros, with potentially even steeper rates like 5–10% on billionaire fortunes above 1 billion euros. Crucially, the proposal stresses it must include all types of assets: real estate, financial assets, and business assets, no exceptions. This comprehensive base contrasts sharply with current property taxes, which typically only apply to real estate, often at flat rates, and frequently ignore mortgage debt. It also differs from existing wealth taxes in some European countries, which are often riddled with exemptions for certain assets, like business assets, and rely heavily on self-declared values, making them relatively ineffective and easy to avoid.
But if it's presented as such an ideal solution in theory, what are the biggest walls we'd hit trying to make this happen in the real world? Why is it considered so utopian by many?
You're right to ask about the challenges of implementation, because they are immense. The research acknowledges that a truly global tax on capital is no doubt a utopian ideal in the current political climate. It faces significant hurdles, most notably tax havens, where a substantial fraction of global financial assets is already hidden away, completely untraced by national tax authorities. There's also a fundamental lack of automatic international information sharing between tax authorities, making it incredibly difficult to track global wealth accurately. Without knowing who owns what across borders, implementing such a tax is nearly impossible. Even individual countries struggle with this. Wealthy citizens can relatively easily move their money abroad to avoid national wealth taxes, as seen in the difficulties faced by Italy, Spain, and Greece when trying to implement or enforce such measures. It requires unprecedented international cooperation and transparency. The research also emphasizes that the ideal tax system is therefore a compromise. All three types of progressive tax on inheritance, on income, and potentially on capital play useful and complementary roles. It's probably not about choosing just one over the others, but about designing a balanced system that addresses inequality from multiple angles. As for alternative, less satisfactory policies to address global economic imbalances and inequality, protectionism and capital controls are mentioned. While protectionism might serve specific national purposes temporarily, it's generally argued not to be a source of prosperity for the global economy in the long run, and, importantly, does nothing to counter the inequality RG, which is identified as the fundamental long-term challenge to equitable wealth distribution.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting, especially for today's policy debates, connecting back to how nations manage their finances. Many countries, particularly in Europe but also elsewhere, are currently grappling with very large public debts, often exceeding a year's national income. The research identifies three main ways to reduce this debt, each with very different implications for fairness and economic stability. What are they?
That's right. The research lays out three main methods for significantly reducing large public debts based on historical experience. First, an exceptional tax on private capital. This is presented as potentially the most just and efficient solution. The reasoning is straightforward. European households, for instance, collectively own private wealth equivalent to all that there is to own in Europe, including its public debt. An exceptional one-time levy on this substantial private wealth, particularly the largest fortunes, could resolve a debt crisis without prolonged austerity burdening the majority of the population or resorting to inflationary measures. It's seen as a way to rebalance the books directly. The second method is inflation. Historically, the research states this is how most large public debts have been dealt with. Germany, for example, famously and dramatically reduced its public debt through hyperinflation in the 1920s and significant inflation after WWII. However, this comes at a steep cost, as high or unexpected inflation can violently destabilize society and economy, and leads to chaotic, uncontrolled redistributions of wealth among social groups, often unfairly and unpredictably, wiping out the savings of some while benefiting others, like debtors. The third method discussed is austerity, which involves prolonged periods of government spending cuts, and potentially tax hikes to slowly pay down debt. This is described in the source as potentially the worst solution in terms of both justice and efficiency. Yet it's often the chosen political course. Austerity can lead to cuts in vital public services, reduced social spending, higher unemployment, and often slower economic growth, potentially making the debt burden even harder to manage in the long run. The central bank's role in this context is also vital. They have shown they have the power to stabilize interest rates and public debt at low levels, essentially managing the cost of the debt, as seen widely after the 2008 financial crisis through quantitative easing and other measures. However, their powers are limited. They cannot oblige companies to invest or households to consume, and they cannot compel the economy to resume its growth. They can provide liquidity and prevent financial collapse, which often wards off deflation, but they cannot fundamentally restart economic dynamism or solve underlying structural problems on their own. They buy time, essentially.
Okay, finally, let's explore some interesting, perhaps more philosophical debates discussed in the research around the golden rule of capital accumulation and how these abstract ideas connect to something as incredibly pressing as climate change. These are big abstract concepts, but they have very real-world consequences for our future, don't they?
Indeed, they do. There's Phelps' Golden Rule, developed by the economist Edmund Phelps back in 1961. This is a theoretical economic concept. It states that the maximal level of capital accumulation is attained when the rate of return on capital R, which is supposed to be equal to its marginal productivity in the theory, falls to be equal to the economic growth rate, G. In simpler terms, it's the theoretical sweet spot where a society has accumulated just the right amount of capital for maximum sustainable consumption per person. Adding more capital beyond this point wouldn't actually increase long-run consumption. In practice, as we've discussed extensively, the historical reality is that R was much greater than G before the 19th century, and it will probably be so again in the 21st century, meaning we are generally operating far from this theoretical golden rule level of capital saturation. We tend to have RG. Now, a completely different golden rule appeared in the European debt debate, specifically in the 1992 Maastricht Treaty that paved the way for the euro. This treaty stipulated strict budgetary constraints for member states. Annual budget deficit should be less than 3% of GDP, and total public debt less than 60% of GDP. These strict budgetary constraints are described as historically unprecedented for sovereign nations managing their own finances, and without simultaneously considering the value of public assets, arguably lack full rational justification from a purely economic standpoint. The research suggests the real reason for these arbitrary-seeming numbers was the political decision to create a common currency without a unified federal state, necessitating strict limits on national borrowing to build market confidence in the new currency and prevent free riding. But perhaps the most fascinating and deeply impactful application of these principles about valuing the future arises in the climate change debate. This is arguably the world's principal long-term worry concerning the deterioration of humanity's natural capital. The 2006 Stern Report, a landmark study, estimated the potential damage to dozens of points of global GDP per year by the end of the century if climate change goes unchecked. Huge potential cost. The core of the controversy among economists, even when they largely agree on the potential physical impacts and costs of climate change, often comes down to the discount rate. That is, the rate at which future damage to the environment should be discounted back into present-day values when doing cost-benefit analysis of climate policies. How much do we value the future relative to the present? Nicholas Stern, leading the UK government report, argued for using a relatively low discount rate, one similar to the expected long-term economic growth rate, around 1 to 1.5% per year. Using a low discount rate means that current generations weigh future damage very heavily, making future catastrophes loom large in today's calculations. This perspective justifies significant immediate spending. Stern estimated around 5 points of global GDP annually to mitigate climate change because the future costs, though far off, are still considered very large when brought back to today's value. William Nordhaus, a prominent American economist often contrasted with Stern, argued for using a higher discount rate, one closer to the average market rate of return on capital, perhaps 4 for 4.5% per year. Using a higher discount rate makes future disasters seem much less worrisome in present value terms. The logic here is partly that future generations will likely be much richer and more technologically advanced and thus better able to cope with the costs of climate change more cheaply than we can today. Why spend massively now if they can fix it more easily later?
So even when experts agree on the scientific problem of climate change, and potentially even the scale of future damages, their economic calculations and policy recommendations can diverge dramatically based on fundamentally different philosophical assumptions about how we value the future and the well-being of future generations compared to our own needs and desires today. This really illustrates how economic models, no matter how sophisticated, always rest on these deep underlying normative choices, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It shows that economics is never purely objective. It's deeply intertwined with ethics and politics, especially when dealing with long-term, intergenerational issues like climate change or wealth inequality. Hashtag outro.
So what does this all mean when we pull back and look at the whole huge picture we've painted today? We've journeyed through centuries of economic thought, from Malthus's dire fears about population to Marx's radical critiques of capitalism's internal logic. We've seen how the very definition and accumulation of capital had transformed over centuries, tracing that surprising U-shaped curve of wealth through devastating wars and periods of peace and reconstruction. We've explored the profound and frankly unsettling implications of the RG dynamic, where capital tends to earn more than the economy grows, and how this powerful mechanism inherently fuels inherited wealth and potentially drives inequality upwards, especially in low-growth eras. And finally, we've wrestled with the complex political and social choices societies face today, from the ambitious, perhaps utopian idea of a global capital tax to the deeply philosophical debate around how we value our planet's future in the face of climate change. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And if history teaches us anything from this deep dive, it's that economic structures are not immutable forces of nature. They are deeply political, chaotic, and unpredictable. They are shaped by events, by ideas, and crucially, by choices. The lessons from the past suggest that real democracy and social justice require specific institutions of their own, not just those of the market, and not just parliaments and other formal democratic institutions. We need tools specifically designed to measure, understand, and potentially regulate economic power and inequality. Ultimately, this deep dive into the historical dynamics of wealth and income underscores that the kind of society we build in the 21st century will depend entirely on how societies view inequalities and what kinds of policies and institutions they adopt to measure and transform them. It's a continuous, active process, not an automatic one, and the outcomes are far from predetermined.
That's a powerful concluding thought. So let me leave you, our listener, with this question to reflect on. Given the historical evidence of RG and the persistent, perhaps strengthening comeback of inherited wealth, what kinds of choices do you think our society should prioritize right now to try and ensure a more equitable future for generations to come? What stands out to you about the choices we face today?